Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of the Afghanistan podcast. Joining us today, we had Professor Richard Sakwa from the University of Kent. Professor Sakwa is a British political scientist with expertise on Russian and Eastern European politics, and he has written many books on these topics. So, Professor Richard Sakwa, welcome and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Professor Sakwa, so to start with, let's talk about Donald Trump. He's been in office now for 5 months. How do you rate his presidency so far, especially in relation to foreign policy?
Yeah, no, thank you for starting with that because I have some thoughts. The way I see it now is that, well, there's many aspects to it, of course, but let me just focus on what I nowadays call what he's doing is a threefold defection. He's defecting from three things. So the first one, the first defection is,
Mhm.
but all of these are not complete, but sort of processes rather than actions which are one and single. But the first defection is from the Atlantic power system that the United States forged. Well, obviously, as part of the alliance in the Second World War, but then in the
Yes.
Cold War, what I call the political West. This is a combination of the United States and the European powers, above all the European Union today. So clearly, we can see that Trump, he's picking up where Barack Obama, was talking about a
Mhm.
decade ago, that it was time. Obama was beginning to focus the pivot to Asia. And so on. So this isn't completely novel, and of course, demanding that the Western European powers pay more for their own defence. But
Mhm.
Trump has taken it to a wholly new level, which, of course, has put the European powers in great alarm, and of course, doing exactly the precise opposite of what they probably should do, which is instead of trying to achieve diplomatic solution and rebuilding pan-continental unity of the Gorbachev or Mitterrand or Gaullist sort, they've
Yes.
decided to militarize and double down on a Cold War strategy, which is a failing strategy, which even Trump understands. So that's the first potential defection from the Atlantic power system, that the NATO and so on, which United States led for so long. The second potential defection, which has already begun, is a bit more disturbing, if one can, in some ways, say welcome the first, because Trump is asking questions that should have been answered 30, 40 years ago at the end of the first Cold War. So the second defection is more disturbing, and that is from the international system established in 1945, with the United Nations at its heart, and with a whole body of international law and international humanitarian law at its heart, which the victorious powers at the end of the Second World War came together, including the Soviet Union, China, India as well, even though it was still a colony in 1945. It was granted the status of a founder member of the United Nations, hugely important. So this is a system based on comity, a word I like nowadays, comity, COMITY, meaning cooperation between the great powers and everybody else. So this international system, in my view, has now matured. 193 members of the United Nations. Decolonization has largely taken place. Obviously, neocolonialism still survives, but basically independent states based on the principle of sovereign internationalism. Well, as you know, Trump has pulled out from the World Health Organization, potentially UNESCO, and so much more. And of course, under Trump, they're reviewing all the international treaties. So this is the potential law, the one in the second defection, which of course is basically a defection from international law, including, you could argue, which is a slightly different issue, from the whole international political economy, of which the United States was at the center. So that's the second defection. The third one is a domestic one, and it's a defection from the traditions of constitutionalism in the United States itself. So this is, riding roughshod over law, ruling largely by presidential decrees, which of course have been challenged in the courts, but nevertheless, extraordinary attacks against universities, recently Columbia and Harvard, and so on. So, and of course, deportations and all of that, which is really quite astonishing. Okay, you could say this isn't the first time. This also happened in the Red Scare of 1920 under Woodrow Wilson, in which over 6,000, mainly Jews, Italians of a leftist orientation, were persecuted, and of course anarchists, Sacco Vanzetti, ultimately given the death penalty. So, and of course the McCarthyite purges of the late 1940s and 1950s, which thousands lost their jobs, lost their careers, totally lawless. But of course, this is where we are today, without the justification of a Cold War. And in a sense, it's a type of Cold War has come home to the United States, and the polarization, which is so intense. And it's a paradox. As I say, the Cold War's come home. And so we have as a type of, so far, fortunately, non-violent, no, at the margins it is violent, civil war, internally, domestically. So those are the three defections. And thank you very much for allowing me to outline some of my thoughts on the Trump phenomenon, which is, of course, on the one side, building on issues which have been there for a long time. On the other side, Trump is a maverick and an individual of, completely a unique phenomenon, of course.
Yes. I think it's very interesting, all the points that you've highlighted, and let's, in this episode, unpack them one at a time. But just a general comment on Trump's delivery of his kind of plans and strategy, if he has one. It just seems so erratic. So 1 minute he's in one direction, then the next minute he just does like a complete U-turn and like nothing ever happened. So it's difficult to predict where we're going to end up with all of these processes by the end. Is he going to stick to the line he's kind of on at the moment? Or is he going to turn around and say to Russia that I'm back in NATO now, I'm back supporting Europe, and Cold War is on, and you are again our enemy? So it's a bit tricky with all of those episodes, how he's going to pan out.
Exactly. He is very much literally a loose cannon, and which every side wants to point him against the enemy. So Zelensky is constantly trying to work so that that cannon is pointing against Putin. Putin, of course, and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, want to point it against Zelensky, Ukraine, and anybody else they don't like. So you're absolutely right. And where, in a sense, it's like a spinning coin, and you can't tell. Yeah, and if you did, you'd be a millionaire. If the coin will end up heads or tails, it could go either way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Trump kind of sees that as his trump card. He kind of is proud of that he kind of keeps everyone guessing. But from a kind of a longer point of view, it's for USA as a state, it's not the best position where your friends, enemies have no idea what to expect from you from day to day.
Yeah, but so this is but Nixon had the madman theory of politics. So you indeed put all your friends and allies, of course, completely off balance and wrong-footed. So that's right. But can I just temper that? This is absolutely the case. I agree completely with you. But I just add one thing. There is, in addition to this constant the shifting sands of Trumpian policy, there is a deep Trump. Now, we can argue about that, but the deep Trump. And what is this deep Trump? Well, clearly, he's always had a mercantilist, transactional, pragmatic view of international politics. Allies are only allies as long as they're useful and pay their way. And so he's got, maybe to reduce it to simplicity, but a New York businessman's view of international politics, hence his emphasis on, making the deal and so on. But, what he has done, and this is the deep Trump, he is actually, as I said, asked questions which really should have been asked a long time ago. And it has taken a Trump to ask these questions, even, for example, today, when it comes to Iran. We know the neocons in Washington wanted to bomb it along with Israel, was urging them to do so. But Trump was looking as if he was thinking of it a few weeks ago. Again, as you say, the volatility. But they're now talking. Finally, he can put an end to the extraordinary, they've since 1979, basically, 1980, how many years is that? 45 years. So, they're talking, maybe a nuclear deal. On the other hand, certain prejudices remain, basically letting Israel off, extraordinary softness towards Israel, and indeed extraordinary harshness vis-a-vis Cuba, piling on the sanctions as if, with a savagery, which is, quite, shocking. Again, Venezuela slightly more ambiguous.
Mm. I think you're right, and it's it's often you hear a lot of criticism for Trump from like Democrats in USA. But then if we look at the record of the Democrats, it was awful. So all of these things, they didn't want to kind of touch any of those kind of issues from a diplomatic or realist point of view. And it was all just kind of doubling down on this kind of attempt to start a new Cold War, which is something that you've written a lot about. Um, Also, what I would like to know is, so you talked about like Trump kind of coming out of the transatlantic alliance. So, how do you think Europe has dealt with it so far? I mean, there was a lot before Trump came along. Before he came into power, there was a lot of talk about Trump-proofing things, Trump-proofing security, Trump-proofing economy. But in reality, it seems like they did an awful job because they were kind of taken by surprise when Trump won the elections, taken by surprise Trump's stance on NATO, and again they were taken by surprise on Trump's stance on tariffs and everything. So far it looks like they're kind of playing catch up constantly rather than having a clear way forward. How do you kind of see how Europe is reacting to Trump's presidency?
Yeah, can I go back? I will go back to it in a second, but can I go back to your comment on the Democratic Party in the
Yeah.
United States? It's fascinating that we go to this because there's two things to say there. I mean, there's many things, but two. First of all, the Democrats have become the war party, and
Oh,
that really is astonishing. Just like, by the way, the Labour Party in the United
yeah.
Kingdom are gone. Of course, they're the Conservatives as well. But it's interesting that the MAGA Republicans have become the Peace Party, and this is reflected in public opinion polls and so on. So a total inversion.
Mm,
And the Democrats, of course, have a disgraceful record in colluding on the Hillary Clinton or the Clintonite wing. Has completely gutted the Democratic Party. You've got Bernie Sanders, you've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Quad, a few other very outstanding Democratic politicians, which I very much laud, and I think they're brave. But even the fact that the Democrats at one point had span out and destroyed Tulsi Gabbard, which is an interesting point, and she had to go over to the Republicans to achieve her
mm,
goal, which is rapprochement, diplomacy, and so on. So, but the underlying thing with the Democrats is that they were the spearhead of that merger of traditional neoconservative American global dominance ideology, the neocon, all the way back to 1990s and earlier, and of course merging with the democratic ideal of liberal internationalism, that the whole world has to look like the United States. That modernization means westernization, means Americanization, under the flag of human rights, of course used selectively and permeated by double standards. So and they put forward this alternative to the United Nations system, which is based on sovereign internationalism. 193 states, the foundations today of multipolarity, whereas the Democrats wanted democratic internationalism, hence the
mm,
architects of regime change, including
yeah.
in Ukraine in 2014, which started a series of events where we see today. So that's a thank you for mentioning the Democrats. As for the European Union, you're absolutely right. Failed to Trump proof, but more than that, in a sense, you can't proof a system against its own domestic and internal contradictions. So Trump proofing was always going to fail, except in which they take the path of least resistance, which is militarization. Now, the next NATO summit will probably set 5% GDP spending on defense, militarization at the time of massive deficits and failures of the Western welfare state. We see that in the United Kingdom, of course, quite dramatically. Just the figures are shocking. Child poverty, the marginalization of whole communities in the north and east of England. And, the list goes on, and inequality and poor housing and so on, which doesn't need just, a house building program. You need a genuine an ability, and here may be getting controversial, well, I was going to talk about United Kingdom and Brexit, but for the Europeans, again, facing, as the Draghi report at the end of 2024 showed, declining competitiveness, deindustrialization of Germany, and major social issues. So that's nothing to do with Trump, but
Yeah.
Trump actually is again asking the right questions, reindustrializing, revalidating working class people. Of course, his blue collar base is part of the MAGA, of course, came into contradiction with the oligarchs and the tech bros and so on. But so you can't, Trump proof or proof against your own failings. And of course, Macron, Merz, Starmer, all very much in that same boat, and of course, I'm afraid that boat is it was fun. And instead of their main response is doubling down on policies that have failed for so many years.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. Yes. Yes, all right. I was kind of cautious at the beginning when Trump was talking about his kind of bringing rights to the workers in USA, but at the same time, as you said, he had all of these kind of oligarchs, well, not the oligarchs, the big kind of Apples and Microsoft and all of the multi-billionaire people. Yes, but then recently, so Elon Musk apparently is leaving the government, and also Trump has warned Apple that he's going to put 25% sanctions on Apple if they try to circumvent the tariffs put on China. So I think that's interesting. So he's not kind of anyone's fool in some ways.
Yeah, it's that in a sense is by analogy with the United States writ large. I think it was Kissinger who said years ago that it's very dangerous to be United States enemy, but even more dangerous to be its friend. And I think that applies to Trump himself. It's
Yes,
pretty bad to be his enemy, but to be
exactly.
his confrere is
Yeah.
pretty difficult.
How do
As
you see, Richard, with Europe trying to now be responsible for their own security, trying to militarize Europe? How do you see this panning out? Because at the moment we see unity in Europe, but I can kind of foresee the more bigger the militaries are going to get, the more differences they're going to develop inside Europe. And we could end up in an awful situation because so far there was peace in Europe because there was like an overlord, which was USA, which was like kind of sitting far away and could be the protector from outside. But now when they're responsible for their own securities, how are countries like France, Germany, UK, um, there was recent talks about France saying that we can provide a nuclear umbrella to Germany, and I was laughing. I was thinking, how is Germany going to tolerate that? So, how do you see all of this panning out in Europe?
Mm. Yeah, I think the underlying issue is that the European Union has turned from a welfare project to a warfare project,
Yes.
and that isn't what it was designed for. That's what you
Yes.
got NATO for. Hence, it's going to be generating a lot of conflict, as you've just alluded to. It's already empowering. The European Union has become East Europeanized. By that, I mean the East Europeans, after the end of the disintegration of the Soviet bloc, instead of being trained in European Union peace language, the idea originally, Monnet idea that you could never have war between France and Germany again,
Yeah.
instead of which, after the 1990s, they welcomed into the European Union countries like Poland and the Baltic republics, who are devoured by revanchist feelings that with Russophobia, well, you
Mm.
can understand, of course, historical grievances, but we've all got a baggage of historical grievances. The whole point of the European Union was to transcend that, to establish a dynamic for peace, instead of which the European Union amplified these resentments, gave them form, gave them force, gave them legitimacy. And we saw that just recently in the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, when those who tried to, even in Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia, and indeed in Poland, to put flowers at the monuments of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands who died in the liberation of these countries, were they put rubbish bins next to it. So insulting. I mean, it was almost incredible, literally, technically incredible what they were doing. And the European Union smiles at it. And of course, you have people like Kaja Kallas, who is the Foreign Affairs Supremo in the EU, who is a virulent Russophobe. She's only got one thing on her mind, and that is to attack Russia. And she also speaks to countries like Serbia, Vucic, the leader there, warning him as if she was a schoolmaster telling off a recalcitrant child. This is going to end badly. So that is the situation. You've got Kubilius, you've got Ursula von der Leyen, a virulent Russophobe, and now the leader of Germany, Friedrich Merz, who's also a virulent Russophobe, who is going to destroy the very last vestiges of that Ostpolitik tradition in Germany, which is all about rapprochement. So, the United States is laughing all the way to the bank. It's now, of course, they've cut off European energy supplies from Russia, so supplied by LNG, liquid natural gas from the United States, at least 4 times more expensive than Russia's pipeline gas. So not a great future for Europe.
How did they allow this situation to happen? Because, am I mistaken? When Ukraine war was starting, so in 2022 or end of 2021, it seemed like it was America that was pushing for NATO expansion eastwards, whereas European countries like Germany and France were like kind of a bit reluctant, cautious, saying that this is going to pose problems. So then we ended up with this war in Ukraine, and then we've ended up, obviously, Biden doing what he was doing, kind of pushing the envelope further and further and further. And now we've got Trump, who's trying to pull out of this whole situation. Maybe I was naive, but I thought at that stage, the European Union, the European countries are going to be relieved that at the end we're seeing an end to all of this nonsense that's destroying their own economies. But they seem like hell-bent on just doubling down on everything. So how did we go from Europe being kind of reluctant to now Europe being hell-bent on destroying Russia?
Yeah. So 2 things there. I very much supported, as you say, the end of 2021, early 2022, in the months before the war, before Russia's invasion of February 2022, that both the French and German leaders went to Moscow, desperately tried to avert the war. But, which, I very much laud, I think that was good. But it just showed that just how subservient and just how powerless these legacy great powers are. France, Germany, Italy. I won't talk about United Kingdom because it's basically, it's a different category. But much the same, I suppose. It's a legacy great power with illusions of grandeur and so on. So these legacy great powers showed just how they lacked strategic autonomy, because the decisions about our continent, our European continent, were made in Washington. And for me, it was one of the most shocking things about this war is that the fate of our continent was decided not in our continent, but far away over the water. And what the United States, proudly, and these Western elites who've bought into this, saying that the United States was a security guarantee. Well, look at us. We're in the middle of a war in which at least 1 million people died on our continent with our people. So, that really has blown that one out of the water. But as you say, why then now they're doubling down on this failed policy? Because these elites are vested in it. They have become so, their political culture, everything is so vested in it, plus this East European context, which we talked about earlier, that they've bought into this sort of subaltern mentality that they then have become more papist than the Pope, when the Pope has moved on, and yet they're doubling down on failed policies. which again, it's when the history books are written, this generation of leaders, Starmer, Macron, Merz, Meloni, others, a few may emerge with a bit of credit, who said no, we must take control of our own destiny, and so this neo-Gaullist policy. Whatever you may criticize Robert Fico in Slovakia or um, Viktor Orban in Hungary, on this issue at least, they were saying sensible things.
You're right. Yeah. Why is there so much Russophobia in Europe? I mean, it is kind of like we talked about Eastern Europe, and that kind of we can see where that's coming from. But with these Western countries like France, Germany, UK, what is their fear of Russia? Is it that they think if Russia was brought into the European community, Russia would overtake them in dominance in Europe, or what is the big fear of Russia? Is it like a rational fear? Is it a rational fear that they actually believe that Russia is out to destroy Europe?
Yeah, this goes back, of course, a long way. Russophobia, described by the excellent book by Guy Metin on Russophobia, goes back 1,000 years to the great schism of 1054 between Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism. And then, of course, in the 19th century, you had the Crimean War. Again, a Franco-British exercise in futility, because again, what was this war? So Russia has always been a sort of big bogeyman to the east. You can see this in the cartoons and everything else. And then today, again, because it refused. Well, let me put it this way. How can we explain this? And, I describe this in my book, The Lost Peace. Basically, at the end of the Cold War, Russia, the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, Boris Yeltsin, then Vladimir Putin, all wanted to join what we mentioned earlier, the political West, this Atlantic power system. And they understood that NATO enlargement was going to be dysfunctional and establish a front line, which would ultimately engender hostilities, militarized hostilities. But of course, Russia was then quite explicitly told, you can't join. So you have this huge security dilemma. I mean, even NATO enlargement in and of itself isn't the issue. Even Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his famous book, this is the former national security advisor under Carter, in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, said, of course, NATO enlargement has to be accompanied by an overarching security treaty with Russia. It was there. Which people have forgotten about. So if that had happened, then you wouldn't have had, then NATO for the European countries. Well, why not? It stops Greece and Turkey going to war, stops Slovakia, Hungary, and all of those, endless irredentist and issues within Europe and of the interwar sort. But once Russia could not join the political West, and the political West then has to justify its own existence by portraying Russia as the enemy, then of course that goes on steroids once you get countries like Poland and the Baltic republics joining, always fostered, and all this Russophobia and aggression, militarism fostered by the United Kingdom and London, almost with a manic energy. Labour and Conservative and the Lib Dems, by the way, and the Greens. So they're all bought into it. So the only person who's ever stood against it is Nigel Farage, which is funnily enough, and the right wing, Peter Hitchens and others in the Daily Mail. But can I just say that one thing which you said, we can understand these feelings of the Baltic and Poland. Yes, of course, they've got a history of legitimate grievances. They were really, obviously, Russian Empire, and the Baltics thrived under the Russian Empire, but and indeed under the Soviet system, they didn't do too badly. But of course, accompanied by mass repression, terror, deportations, which we unequivocally condemn. I certainly do. But you say we can understand it. I cannot understand it, because after 1991, Russia emerged, helped them gain their independence. Not the Soviet Union, the Russia under Yeltsin and then even Putin. So I cannot understand it, because Russia did everything possible. It withdrew its troops to establish a positive peace order on the European continent. And these guys destroyed it. This virulent Russophobia in Lithuania was never extirpated. In fact, ultimately, Brussels fed it. So I do not understand it, because it was a suicidal strategy which turned Russia into an enemy which you didn't need to do. Russia has got no border demands on these countries, but the others have. In fact, Estonia and Latvia have, border demands on territorial demands on Russia. So Russia was always saying, we'll accept the existing borders. We're not happy. But for Ukraine, of course, the condition was neutrality, not, it wasn't going to join NATO anytime soon. But NATO was in Ukraine. Ukraine was not going to join NATO. So as I say, I can't understand it because it was illogical. I mean, underlying your question was a sense, okay, it was a sort of systemic structural. No, it was elites and decisions and failure of policy for over 30 years.
Thank you, Richard, for correcting me on that. Actually,
Yeah, well,
I was interviewing.
not correcting, but
ex-Maltese-
slightly adding to what you're saying.
No, thank you. I was actually interviewing just 1 or 2 days ago the ex-foreign minister of Malta, who was foreign minister from 2022 to 2024, quite recently. And he was lamenting this fact as well. He was saying that he's more upset when he remembers that it was in 1989 that Gorbachev and Bush met in Malta, where Gorbachev said to Bush that we will not interfere in the politics, internal politics of these ex-Soviet states, or which direction they want to go into in terms of foreign policy. And Bush said that Gorbachev, we will not take advantage of this policy that you have. So Everest was basically saying that this was kind of a prelude to the West kind of giving assurances to Russia that we're not going to expand NATO into the direction of Russia, and there will be kind of a mutual respect from both sides. And all of that was thrown out of the water. And since then, on every occasion, the West has just tried to dominate, not have any kind of diplomacy, negotiations, no talks. It's just constant domination, bullying. So he was very upset with all of that, and it kind of completely mirrors what you just said as well.
Yeah, the Malta summit in December 1989, in a sense, is officially the end of the Cold War. And as you say, thank you for reminding us that it really was a moment in which a whole new type of politics was going to develop, based on the principle of comity, as I suggested earlier, cooperation between great powers, based on the principles of the United Nations Charter, sovereign internationalism, non-interference in the internal affairs of country, and also one of the fundamental ideas was that European security was single and indivisible, instead of which, very quickly, the United States reneged and its Western allies, who didn't object to it. This is what's so astonishing, is that, when Washington and neocons and the liberal internationalists in Washington started making policy, okay, France and Germany objected to the illegal, appalling invasion of Iraq in 2003. But, United Kingdom, of course, not only enthusiastically joined in, but also explicitly lied to justify the invasion, which was really, again, London should be ashamed of itself, just as it was over Libya in 2011. So, but the thing about the London or the British public sphere is that these people are simply not held to account. You move on as if it didn't happen, and it's so shocking. It's as if the unbearable lightness of politics today. You do this thing, you destroy a country. Oh well, that was a bit of a mistake. Let's move on and do another one.
Yeah. First, let me correct myself. So Everest was the foreign minister of Malta from 2020 to March 2022, so a month after the invasion of Ukraine started. But also, in one of your recent books, you have the title or the subtitle, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but how the West failed to prevent the Cold War, the start of the Second Cold War. But it seems like it's not just that they prevented it, but they actively seeked to start this Cold War. And this whole Ukraine episode is part of that. And you talked about Hillary Clinton earlier. I think if Hillary Clinton had won that election against when Trump came along in his first term, I think all of this would have started a lot earlier, because she was constantly saying that she wants to basically confront Russia.
Yeah. Absolutely. The 2016 election, when Trump beat Hillary Clinton, was fateful in all sorts of ways. Hillary Clinton was, passionately in favor of the coup, and her friends Victoria Nuland and so on, who managed it, and Biden midwifed it, as we know. But it's interesting. In 2016, Trump was elected on a platform of it makes sense to get on with Russia. And so this is one of those deep Trump ideas. And he's right, of course. The rapprochement between Washington and Moscow does make sense. We're not talking about at the expense of anyone, not against anyone, of course not, but overcoming this logic of conflict, because there's no substantive reason for them to be in conflict, which is astonishing. Unfortunately, in 2016, those false allegations of Russiagate, which is that Trump and Putin were colluding in some ways, and this whole Russiagate hoax has been running now for nearly a decade. I wrote a book about it called Deception, and it's still there. And what it did was hobbled him explicitly, as you say, not by accident, deliberately in 2016. And of course, the architect of Russiagate was Jake Sullivan, who then becomes the national security advisor in Biden's administration from 2021. And he is, of course, the architect of this Russo-Ukrainian war. He was the one who pushed it. No negotiations, no diplomacy, no talking. Of course, there was the Geneva summit in mid 2021, but Biden was by then completely out of it. What was meant to be, several hours of discussion turned out to one short session, separate press conferences, and no substantive debate about European security. Again, the fate of Europe being decided and discussed by Putin was a European leader, but certainly not by our core European leaders. Again, a type of Yalta, as always, and yet no one seems to notice this. So Trump, the Russiagate thing was a huge lost opportunity. So this is why Trump, in his second administration, has vowed not to make those mistakes again, and has really hit the ground running, and to try to make those changes. So, but as you say, the Cold War. In the book, The Lost Peace, one describes it wasn't just simply how the West failed to prevent it. It's the structure of Western thinking, ideology, and such like, which refused to allow Russia to emerge as a separate center of power. It would displace Brussels and Washington. And of course, the idea being that once Russia has been weakened, they move on to China, which is almost, again, this type of international politics is what we're talking about, which I challenge, you challenge. We really are saying, this is just pointless. You don't, the best defenses, and of course the American conservative, the Journal, argued today that the best defense of Taiwan is not to keep talking about the defense of Taiwan, but to allow a diplomatic process, and the same applies to Ukraine earlier.
Yep. One of the things that really surprised me at the start of this war in Ukraine, how completely the voices of kind of opposing this war were silenced on social media, on mainstream media, articles being published in newspapers. There was no one kind of criticizing what was going on. Everyone was just kind of, it's a little bit like this. I don't know if you've seen what happened between this current conflict between India and Pakistan, and how the Indian media just kind of went hell-bent on propaganda, saying that India's destroyed Karachi and the prime minister being arrested and the chief of army staff run away. So it just all kind of, it wasn't like slight propaganda based around some factual information. It was all just complete rubbish. And there was no one challenging anything. So I was really surprised by that. I mean, obviously, for me, like being a Muslim, and we heard so much about how freedom of expression is so important in the West. And every time there was a cartoon or something kind of insulting the Prophet, and there was an outcry in the Muslims, the West was saying, what are you talking about? We have like complete freedom of expression. So there's nothing we can do about it. Just shut up. And then this came along, and it was a complete blanket kind of, everyone was talking in the same kind of from the hymn sheet. So how did you find that as an academic, as someone in this field? How did you? It must be quite difficult in those days to talk about the things that you're talking about now.
Well, not to this point, it's not just in those days; it's in these days as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you're absolutely right that the public discourse has in Europe and well, less so in the United States, by the way, where you have a whole
Yeah.
ecosystem. I mean, ecosystem, with the Grey Zone Consortium News, stacks of really excellent, alternative. Forms of analysis, the Jacobin, for example, and others, which I think you've been involved with, and Counterpunch, Portside. There's a whole stack of
Yes,
stuff.
a lot. Yeah.
Whereas in United Kingdom, almost nothing. The
Mm.
only thing which we've got, which is really independent and interesting, is this online journal in United Kingdom called Unheard, which is quite good. Some of its articles are very weak, but on the whole, it's a critical forum for a variety of voices. So, as you say, for me, I just go on and do my work, academic work, and try to ignore all the noise. One thing which I had to do, which I never really got into, is that I could never go on social media because if I was immediately, there's a whole unit in Kiev in the presidential administration which is orchestrating attacks on Western independent thinkers. Talk about, intimidation. It's really shocking. And of course, some of it earlier was supported by the Democratic State Department. So, to so-called attacking disinformation and fake news, which then became a disinformation industry of its own. You're absolutely right about the failure of public debate and discourse. Those voices critical of war and militarism have been silenced. Even SIPRI in the Swedish Stockholm International Peace Research Institute seems to have been seized by a similar sort of evolution. I mean, I may be wrong in that, in which case I apologize, but it seems to have moved away from its peacenik background. And just one final point, what makes it even more disturbing is that so much of the left, the former left wing, has also moved in that direction. There are some notable exceptions, of course. We have in the United Kingdom the Stop the War Coalition. We have still the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and some others. And, going up and down the land, I constantly come across people who, would think in the sort of the lines which we're talking about today. And that's very encouraging. And I get a lot of emails in support of what we're saying. So, they're still, so I just plug on and do the analysis. I'm now actually writing a book on the Russo-Ukrainian War. It's called The Russo-Ukrainian War: Follies of Empire, which will take the story forwards to the present day.
How do you see? Well, first of all, before we go into talking about future possibilities of peace, I just feel that when historians look back at what just happened in this period in the war in Ukraine, obviously there's a lot to talk about what Biden did, what the role that Germany played, France, UK, all of these countries. But I just I can never get over the fact that Ukrainian government allowed itself to be such a pawn in the hands of the US, the Western powers, that they allowed their country to be destroyed, their generations to be destroyed, talents, lives lost needlessly. And basically they could have navigated in a way that they would be a neutral state between these two kind of conflicting powers, and they would have had a really bright future because they could have kind of made the best out of both of the sides, and maintain that neutral state. And I think that's, for me, that's the one saddest thing that I just can't get over. And I think in future people will look back and wonder, how did they allow this to happen?
Absolutely. Even worse than what you just said, which I agree completely with that, is that twice the Ukrainian people, even after the Maidan revolution, the coup or whatever you want to call it, of February 2014, twice the Ukrainian people voted for the peace candidate, for Petro Poroshenko, who pretended to be in favor of peace in May 2014, and then even more, Vladimir Zelensky in April 2019, when 73% of the population across the country, not just in the West or the center, but also the South and the East, voted for Zelensky as the peace candidate, who were precisely aiming for what you've just said, which, in other words, to prevent their country becoming a pawn, a proxy in the contests or the ambitions of external powers. And so it's absolutely shameful for this leadership, in particular Zelensky, who allowed his country to be destroyed in the way you've just outlined for goals which cannot be achieved against a neighbor whose demands were not unreasonable. Neutrality, no NATO membership, protecting Ukraine as a multicultural, multi-confessional, multilingual society. That's normal. Canada is United Kingdom. We've given devolution to Wales, in which I'm delighted to see that the Welsh language is being advanced and supported in Wales. Magnificent language, magnificent culture. Let's develop it. As you know, we've moved in that direction. Why couldn't Ukraine do it? So those are legitimate demands. And of course, above all, Russia's security concerns were also legitimate. I'm not saying the response was legitimate. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the demands initially and to this day are not illegitimate. And so Ukraine could easily have, it wasn't going to join NATO anyway, anytime soon, but it allowed NATO to be in it. And the British were, of course, as always, in the vanguard of supporting the most radical and suicidal policies in Kiev, including Boris Johnson's visit on the 9th of April 2022, when he had effectively a deal, and he, amongst others, basically kiboshed it and said, we'll supply the arms. If you're willing to die for our purposes, then you repudiate this peace deal, which was agreed effectively, 95% agreed at Istanbul. So yeah, it's an astonishing thing. As you say, the history books will look back at this and regard this as a monumental failure of Ukrainian statecraft, because what should a leader do? Protect his or her people, make them more prosperous and more happy by the end of your leadership, instead of which this comedian has led Ukraine to perdition. And of course, he's completely out of his depth. He's a brilliant PR. That's why he's popping up all over the place. He's like an irrepressible jack in the box. Today he's in Berlin, tomorrow in Rome, the day after in Washington. He never stops. Instead of looking after his people, saving his people, stopping this war. And more than that, he turns peace into an instrument of war. This demand for a 30-day ceasefire is an aggressive militaristic act, because you have negotiations before and the terms in which a ceasefire. So a ceasefire today explicitly will be used by Kiev, London, and Berlin and Paris as an excuse to pile in Western forces, more military and so on, which destroys the whole point of why this war began in the first place. And so they've learnt nothing. Like the Bourbons, learned nothing and forgotten nothing.
Exactly. Because it just seems like the West was just hell-bent on fighting Russia until the last Ukrainian, and Zelensky was just more than willing to oblige, which is tragic. But looking into the future, and you've touched upon this, I think you're so right, because it seems like Zelensky wants a 30-day kind of a ceasefire before any negotiation can take place. And there's no way Russia is going to accept that, because, as you say, that's going to be taken as an opportunity to rearm and regroup Ukrainian war efforts, or the Western war efforts in Ukraine. But how do you see things panning out, given that, like, it seems like at the moment Trump is getting frustrated with Putin as well? Recently, he said that Putin's gone insane or crazy or something like that. And Putin is also kind of, this seems like they're giving up on USA's ability to stop this. So they're just doubling down on the war efforts. How do you see this panning out? And in June, I think 2nd or 3rd of June, there's going to be some peace talks. What do you see the future of those?
Well, this is where, again, the Western mass media have been misleading, and Zelensky, of course, as always, because the first Istanbul meeting a few weeks ago, said one apart from the prisoner swap was that both sides would go away and establish the terms of further negotiation, a memorandum for both sides. What are your demands? And obviously, we know that Ukrainian demands are absolutely maximalist, to go back, as if nothing had happened after 1 million deaths. Whereas Russia's sticking to its position, which is above all the neutrality for Ukraine, limits on its militarism, and of course cultural rights for Russophone and others within Ukraine, and a few other things, the territorial issue, Crimea, and of course now the 4 republics, which of course, in other words, Russian demands now are bigger than they were in Istanbul in 2022. How do I see it? Well, I'm very pleased that if Trump could, for a minute, stop listening to those crazies from London, Paris, and Berlin and Kiev, and listen to what Russians are saying, which is, let's continue this peace process, let's continue the talk. Of course, at the same time, there's much talk of a spring-summer offensive, and it's quite possible. So Ukrainian forces, Russia hasn't moved very far, but what it has done has, it's a war of attrition, and has really weakened the Ukrainian forces, though morale is still being maintained. We don't know the exact numbers, but some people say Ukraine still has 800,000 men in the field. Right. And Russia's got 650,000. And of course, in this war with drones, artificial intelligence, it's the advantages on the defensive side rather than such like. But now that this summer is coming, the ground is hardening. It will perhaps allow tanks and other elements, though of course it'll need huge coverage, because drones can, a $500 drone can blow out a $10 million tank, or a $50 million tank. Yeah. So in short, we always say that these things cannot be settled on the battlefield, but both sides are trying to use battlefield advantage to enhance their negotiating position, which of course only promises to drag the war on to at least the end of this year, possibly into the beginning of next. As for Trump, he's saying he'll walk away by all means. But if while walking away, if he doesn't apply yet more sanctions, and of course we know Lindsey Graham has got a really powerful, vicious sanctions legislation in Congress, which may be passed despite Trump. So walking away, ultimately, any peace deal will need the United States to guarantee it, to be a guarantor state, perhaps along with China, India, Pakistan, Brazil, South Africa, that, in other words, a coalition, not of the willing or of the killing, as we call it, but a peace coalition would be perhaps the way to go forwards. So, but at the moment, we're just focusing on, I suppose, on the next round of the Istanbul talks, as well as developments on the battlefield.
Because ultimately, if Trump was to completely stop all military aid and intelligence provided to Ukraine, surely, even with all the European backing, they cannot continue the war without US backing. So if at some point, because in some ways Trump can't completely walk away. I mean, if he walks away, it means that he is giving up on Ukraine, and they will say that he's siding with Russia. Or if he stays in the negotiation, I mean, walking away in a way is not like a neutral kind of an action. It's basically a choosing sides, or you're favoring one side or the other. So how do you see that, with the possibility that, because on one hand he's saying that if Russia doesn't listen, then we will apply sanctions, which he hasn't done so far. On the other hand, he's telling Ukraine that if we don't get anywhere, America will simply walk away. Do you think realistically they can walk away?
Yeah. No, indeed, it's whether they can, and indeed, if they try to, in what manner they'll try
Yeah.
to extricate it. Because Trump has said a few times that this is Biden's war. I mean, that's false, of course, because Trump himself started delivering the stingers and so on in 2017,
Yes.
which escalated the situation far more
Richard
even than
Sakwa.
Obama, who refused to do so. So it was always in part Trump's war. But the United States itself is trying to act as a mediator while at the same time being a protagonist in the war.
Yeah.
So again, that the whole ambiguity. Uh, so it'll be, yes. In other words, walking away takes many different forms. If it, and even if Trump personally was no longer so much engaged, we still got Congress and the whole neocon
Mm.
Dem, caucus, which is baying for war. And of course, encouraged by those endless telephone calls by the coalition of the killing, that is the Starmer, Merz, Macron, Zelensky gang, the Gang of Four, who constantly telephoning and bombarding Trump with
Yeah.
false information and very virulent war talk. So and it's very hard, I imagine, if you're Trump, getting these four, the Gang of Four, constantly going on at you about betrayal and such like, and of
Yeah.
course the neocons at home. So all we can say is that commend him for his bravery to have got even this far, to have started some sort of negotiations, which Biden never did. 3 years
No.
of war,
And he never would have
nothing.
known.
Which is, and worse than that, the European Commission also never engaged in any diplomacy. And again, when the history books are written, this will be in the annals of of perdition. Then that will be, a whole chapter will be devoted to that. The failure
I,
of our European leaders to look
yeah.
after our security and
Yeah.
well-being.
And I do think that if Biden had won this election, I do think that we would have been a very big possibility of a nuclear confrontation because neither side was backing down. I mean, Biden just kept doubling down on, and Germany's kind of taking over that mantelpiece now of providing long-range missiles to Ukraine. Um, Actually, so to end up with a couple of questions for you. Firstly, between Germany and Russia, do you see if there was any peace in the future? Do you think that pipeline and economic normality coming back into place, or do you think that that kind of relationship is now severed forever because now Russia has new pipelines, new outlets, and new trading partners in the east? Or do you think over time Germany can't last without that, and for its own economic survival, they will have to reestablish those relations with Russia in the long term? And secondly, do you think um, America, Trump is trying to create some distance between Russia and China, and do you think they will be successful? Because it doesn't look likely, regardless of what relations Russia will have with China, with America. I don't think that they can ever, or in the long term, separate themselves from China because of the very strong bonds they have now.
Mm. On the first point, uh, that for German-Russian relations to be normalized, it'll mean before that the European Union itself has to be normalized, and there's no sign of one or the other. But we do know that German public opinion, that the strong vote for AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, and indeed for Saga Wagenknecht and Die Linke, suggests that German popular public opinion is shifting away from the militarism. Will the pipeline be established? Trump, of course, floated the idea a few weeks ago of re-establishing Nord Stream, which, of course, would immediately fill that energy shortfall, which is
Yeah.
35 billion, 55, well, 35 to 55 billion cubic meters of gas a year, of cheap gas. So it would immediately solve every problem of energy shortfall and reindustrialization. But the ideology is so intense at the moment, and of course, with the Gang of Four dedicated to the destruction of Russia, this isn't going to happen. But I'll just predict, in the years to come, the tide will turn. We will see rapprochement between Germany and Russia. But by then, as going on to your second point, yes, Russia has turned. Russia is now post Western. It doesn't mean it's anti Western, but it's
Yeah.
post Western. It has now understood that you cannot deal with these people that this has been for many, many years, that George Bush Sr. reneged on the promise of no NATO enlargement of 1990. And then, of course, even now say there was no such promise at all. And of course, there wasn't technically, but many verbal assurances, which is just as good in traditional cultures. So, yeah, that's the first thing. And the second, the Russo-Chinese alignment, as you intimate, is very firm, and in fact, it is in the interests of both states. Yes, the United States and Western powers are constantly saying Russia's a junior partner. There's all sorts of asymmetries. Yes, there are tensions in there, but they share a 4,260 kilometer long shared border. The last thing they need is for that again to become a militarized threat to either side. More than that, they're economically compatible and politically compatible. And of course, Putin and Xi Jinping have a very strong personal relationship. So, and many, many more factors. Yes, it's not without problems, but what relationship isn't? But so any idea of those splitting is not going to happen. And it's not going to happen even after Putin and Xi Jinping, because this is in the interests of both states. Again, as they stress, it's not aligned against anyone. It is for what Xi Jinping and the Chinese say, win-win situation. Let's listen to that idea and let's give it a try, is what I say. Let's move away from the Western zero-sum game to a community of common destiny. Let's give it a try.
Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate the time you've given us and the insights. It's been amazing talking to you.
Thank you.